Hello, my name is Chris Snow and I'm going to walk you through how you can set up Zeppelin on IBM BigInsights. We're going to break this down into 4 main steps. First, we're going to provision a BigInsights cluster. Next, we're going to obtain a repository of BigInsights examples and set that repository up. We're going to install the Zeppelin example from that repository, and then we're going to configure Zeppelin to add some user accounts. Okay, first step, let's provision a BigInsights cluster. So you need to be logged on to Bluemix, and from Bluemix you can select the catalog. Inside the catalogue you can search for BigInsights. We will choose a basic cluster, so we can click on Create. Let's open the management console for BigInsights. And from here we need to create a new cluster. Provide a cluster name, the username and passwords. And from the optional components, we'll also select Spark because we will want to run Spark from Zeppelin. Next, we need to get hold of the BigInsights examples repository. The repository is available on GitHub, and you can see the URL in my browser window. The BigInsights examples repository contains a number of example projects that help you quickly get started with BigInsights. You install the repository of examples on your client machine, so on your laptop or your desktop, and you configure the repository to connect to your BigInsights cluster, and the examples work with your cluster over the network. We will skip over the section for the prerequisites for the BigInsights examples repository and also for the setup instructions. We'll look at those later. But for now, let's just take a quick look at the examples. So this page lists the examples that you can run against your cluster. There's a brief description of each example, followed by a link that will take you to another page which will describe how you can run the example against your cluster. Okay, let's go back to the setup page and we'll walk through the prerequisites and the setup instructions. I'm assuming that you meet the first and second prerequisites, that you have a client machine that's connected to the internet, and that you also have a BigInsights cluster that you can run these examples against. The next prerequisite is that you need the Java 8 JDK, and you can test that by opening up a terminal window and then typing the command Java C, which stands for the Java compiler, space -version, and you should see a version number which includes the string 1.8 followed by some other numbers. And you also need Git installed on your machine as well. You can test for Git using Git and then space --version. If you don't have the Java 8 JDK or Git installed on your client machine, then follow the links on the README for getting those installed. Next, we need to download the repository onto your local machine, and you can do that using the git clone command. Change into the repository directory, and we need to copy the connection properties template file to connection.properties, and next edit that file with your editor. Here we need to change the property for the gateway hostname. We can get the hostname by going back to the BigInsights management console on Bluemix, and clicking on the cluster name will give us the SSH hostname. We can copy that and paste that into the connection properties file. Paste the same hostname in the Ambari URL. And then next we need to set the username, the SSH username, and the SSH password. And again repeat for the Ambari username and password. We also need to uncomment one of the lines in the connection properties to allow any hosts. We can now run a Gradle command. Gradle is just a tool that we use to automate jobs within the examples repository. So we have a task name called download certificate, and this task is being run by Gradle. Gradle is connecting to the cluster using the properties that we just populated in connection properties, and it will download the SSL certificate for that cluster. You can see the build was successful. Next, we'll also do the same for downloading some of the JDBC libraries from the cluster. Okay, and again we have build successful. So we have finished the general setup for the examples repository. The next step is now to actually install Zeppelin using the Zeppelin example. So I suggest that you read the overview and the security notice in your own time, but we'll just spend a few minutes looking at how clients will connect to the Zeppelin service running on the BigInsights cluster. A design decision was made with the Zeppelin example that by default the Zeppelin service shouldn't listen on a publicly exposed HTTP port. Instead, we install Zeppelin so the service listens on port 8080, which is firewalled away from the internet. So client machines need a different way of accessing the BigInsights host, the Zeppelin service running on the BigInsights host. And we do this as shown in the diagram, where we have the local machine, the client machine. It has an SSH session, which is shown by the bottom box. And with SSH, when you SSH from a client to a server, you can pass some parameters which tell the SSH client to bind to a local port on the client machine and then forward any traffic that arrives at that port to the SSH server, which will then forward it to the Zeppelin service running on the BigInsights cluster. So this means that client connections require the user to have an SSH session, so they need an SSH username and password to be able to access Zeppelin. But it does give us an added layer of security that only users with SSH access can access Zeppelin. Okay, so now we can actually have a look through how we get Zeppelin installed. We have some requirements for running the Zeppelin example. One is the prerequisites that we've already completed. The other requirement is the setup instructions, which we've completed. And the first thing we want to do is find the section for installing Zeppelin. So we can head back to our command line and change into the examples and then the Zeppelin folder. And we need to copy the Zeppelin environment template and we can then just check the port number that we have configured here, and that's 8080 by default, so you can change that port number if you want to. And then we do the same again, we copy the shiro.ini template, and let's just take a quick look inside that file. At the moment there's no users, all the users are commented out. Okay, next step is to run the Gradle install command. This installs the Zeppelin example on your cluster. You can see in the output that we have what looks to be a failure, where we have a message saying failed command due to the kinit command not found. Now on a basic BigInsights cluster, Kerberos isn't installed, so this output can safely be ignored. The install does actually take quite a while, so I'm going to pause the recording now and I'll come back when it's finished. So the install has finished. You can see we have the output build successful, so this is telling me everything has run okay. The next thing we can do is we can run a command gradlew connect, and this connect command will set up a temporary SSH tunnel for us, so that allow us to easily test the connection to Zeppelin. In the output you can see a URL, and that URL gives the port number that Zeppelin's bound to locally, which is 12345. The shiro.ini didn't have any users set up, so we can't log in at this stage. Next, we just want to verify that we aren't able to connect to port 8080 on the public internet address, and we can do that using the telnet command. Eventually this command will just time out. We are now on the final part of the walkthrough, where we can set up some Zeppelin users to access the Zeppelin service. So let's scroll to the section granting users access to Zeppelin, and this just gives you some examples of how to set up user accounts within the shiro.ini file. So here I'm just going to add a user, Chris equals, and then my password for the password. I can save that file. After that I can run the Gradle update environment command. What this does is copies the shiro.ini from my local folder to the cluster. So that file's just copying across now. and then we can restart the Zeppelin service to pick up that file. Great, everything's looking okay. If we look for the example now for running Zeppelin, we do have Zeppelin running at the moment, but the run command will output some details that we can use for users to set up their SSH port forwarding. So you can see in the output here that we have an example for SSH. So the -L flag to SSH tells SSH to set up a to bind the port 12345 on the local client and then forward it to the Zeppelin service on port 8080. So we just need to log in with our credentials, and if we have logged in okay, then that port forwarding should be set up for us. So we can see here that we're listening locally on port 12345. So if we open a connection to localhost, so again it's connecting to our local machine on port 12345, and we can put in the new user and the password and log in. And one final thing you may want to do is there's a PySpark test notebook, and this just downloads a dataset from the internet and puts that dataset in HDFS. Okay, and then we can use Spark on the cluster to read in that dataset and just simply do a row count to test that Spark's working okay. So we're running the Spark command now to load that text file. This does take quite a while to run the first time. If we go back to the SSH session on the server, on the cluster, we can run yarn application -list, and this will show us the yarn application that has been submitted by Zeppelin. And we can see the job's finished now. It's given us the row count that we expected. So Zeppelin has run PySpark okay for us. And just as a final check, if we run yarn application list again, we can see that Zeppelin keeps open the yarn application so that we shouldn't have such a long delay the next time we run a Spark command, because we have to wait for the yarn application to be submitted. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening.